In addition to these structure and functional changes, we have to understand the development of the brain from adolescence to adulthood. Most importantly, the executive functioning aspect of our brain is what we call the prefrontal cortex, and it's kind of like the CEO of the brain. It's running the ship. It's the last area of the brain to mature, and it controls everything from good judgment, impulses, problem solving, setting goals, organization, and planning. And because it is the last part of the brain to develop, that is why teens tend to be much more impulsive and engage in risk-taking, because their ability to tap into impulse controls and other parts of the brain to help them think about long-term consequences just aren't fully developed. As a result, teens are really living in what we call the limbic system. So teens often use the word like drama to describe what their lives, feel like, and that's generally because teens process information differently than adults do. So while adults usually rely on the frontal lobe to respond to situations, adolescents rely on what we call the amygdala, which is like an almond-sized part of the brain, and that is our flight or fight. And so this means that teens are more likely to respond emotionally to a situation. And teens also have difficulties trying to find words to express their feelings, and so they react more quickly and without really kind of considering the consequences of their actions. So as they move through adolescence, they learn to read other people's emotions, but still frequently misinterpret how others feel. And they may confuse things like sadness or concern for anger. And a lot of that is because our brains are developing that allows us to tap into the different more complex parts of our brain that help us really understand complex emotions in others. And so the developing brain can be very vulnerable to stress, and in emotionally charged situations, teens are going to overreact because they're relying on their limbic system. So they're going to push boundaries and they're going to break rules. They may cry or get angry without any apparent reason. And as the brain matures, teens will operate more and more from the cortex where reasoning and judgment occur. Whether it's speeding, staying out late, planking, anything that's on TikTok, dancing, puberty and changes in the brain motivate them to seek new experiences and find excitement. And so teens perceive risks differently than adults do. Gangs to actually family relationship violence, like domestic violence. And in order for healthy development, teens need a predictable and stable environment at home, at school, and in their communities. They need to be able to feel safe and nurtured. So teens that are growing up in fear and chaos tend to spend more time in their survival brain, trying to feel okay, rather than in activities that actually develop and stimulate the prefrontal cortex. So just like a machine running over and over and over again, it's eventually going to wear down and stop working. And this is how the amygdala works. It is constantly sending signals, and teens are worrying about their own safety. They start to become very anxious and react versus think about the situation. So when people grow up in tumultuous environments where they're exposed to a lot of family violence or victimization or even violence within their home, it impacts our stress response systems. And so the more kind of stressors that children experience, the more likely that they're going to be sensitive to external stimuli and stressors, which may heighten a lot of the risk-taking, impulse control, and issues that teens are experiencing. Because if teens are not using or working out their cortex, they're often having trouble paying attention, standing still, and controlling their emotions. And so if they have a heightened exposure to violence, especially early on, they're going to be at a higher risk for negative outcomes later in life, such as depression, suicidal thoughts, teen pregnancy, and even substance abuse. And we know this from a series of studies on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And these are experiences that include things like physical, emotional abuse, neglect, mental illness, and violence in their community. The more ACEs a child has, the more he or she is likely to suffer from things later in life like heart disease, diabetes, not doing well in school, abusing substances, and even delinquency. And what we know is experiencing many ACEs, as well as things like racism and community violence, without adequate support systems like caring adults, it causes what we know as toxic stress. And this is excessive activation of our stress response systems that can lead to long-lasting wear and tear on the body and the brain. And so it's basically like the more ACEs, it would be the similar effect to revving a car engine for days or weeks at a time. Here in Colorado, to see that over half of children and youth do not experience any ACEs. But on the other hand, about 1 in 5 experience 2 or more, which is slightly above the national average. And this is problematic because of the outcomes that ACEs have been linked to. So the more that a child grows up in a chaotic environment where they are not getting the stimuli necessary to really exercise their brain, to help them develop the parts of the brain that help them with rational decision making, impulse control. So the more kind of ACEs they have during childhood, the more negative effects that can happen throughout the life course. Now, this doesn't mean that just because people had chaotic childhoods, they turn out to be people who engage in crime. There's a lot of mediating factors that can come into play, and a lot of those mediating factors are things that we are going to learn throughout the semester. And so if you have supportive environments, mentors, counseling, adequate nutrition, like these are all things that dramatically reduce the likelihood that the ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, are going to impact negative outcomes in the future. And so unless we understand kind of how violence and trauma and abuse and neglect and racism and inadequate health and nutrition during childhood, that all impacts our stress response systems. And so the more chaotic the environment, the more sensitive our stress response systems are, the more likely that adolescents are going to have a hard time paying attention in school, being able to navigate relationships. And the more that those cause negative consequences, the harder it is in adulthood as well. But the good news is that we've learned from the brain science literature is that most people who engage in crime and delinquency when they are younger eventually get out of that. And so really we need to be focusing on our efforts of that 5 to 10% of youth who continue to engage in crime all the way into adulthood. And what we know from research is generally that 5 to 10% of chronic offenders likely have much higher ACE scores, meaning that they have much more adverse childhood experiences than individuals who never engage in crime or eventually desist from engaging in crime. Isn't the teen brain fun?